friends, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here at this first seminar of a series of seminars devoted to social and economic challenges of COVID-19 pandemic. The idea of these seminars belongs to our great friend and our visit Professor Jamie Galbraith. We somehow worked with this proposal, and our counter proposal was to make not only one seminar. This was an initial proposal by Jamie, but to make a series of seminars. And the idea was that the problem has a diversity of aspects. All of us do understand that economic and social consequences of this pandemic are numerous, and it would be interesting to our mind, and Jamie agreed with this idea, to have a series of seminars, and during those seminars we could discuss the current impact on social sphere and the economy of the pandemic, challenges for social and economic policy and experience of different countries in fighting them. And also a very interesting topic is that of what's going to be with the economic system, with the world economy after the pandemic is over. Here on this slide, I'm not going to speak a lot on that, but you can see that if current impact on social sphere and the economy as far as it is concerned, we can see, and everybody understands, that there is a significant influence on the redirection of resources to the activities which are on the front line of the struggle against the pandemic. Then social distancing, which is quite widespread all over the world now, also influences significantly production, commodity flows, and relative prices. A lot of financial troubles emerged. Many financial markets nearly collapsed, and foreign exchange rates increased their volatility significantly. And of course, aggravation of social problem is probably one of the most important things in the short run perspective, which makes all the governments to pay attention to them. They have to ensure basic needs of people in the face of reception and the rupture of production chains. Also, quite an interesting problem of how important is potential risk of disruption of the sowing campaign and subsequent problems with food supply. Of course, the danger of massive bankruptcies, especially of small and medium businesses. Unemployment is a great problem. And of course, even the range of social psychological problems associated with the long isolation regime is also here. Then, of course, it's very interesting how different governments react to those challenges. And of course, all of them, they face numerous trade-offs, and one of them being that between the task of mitigating acute social problems and maintaining economic activity. Another one is between maintaining economic activity and financial stability. How important is this? How difficult is this trade-off to be tackled? And the problem, of course, among social problems, there is such a problem as that of sharing the burden of fighting the pandemic between different social groups. And of course, the topic of what's going on with economy after pandemic also interests a lot of researchers, policymakers right now, and even ordinary people. First of all, I think that few people doubt that institutional changes will take place in the health sector, because this pandemic, it showed us that not everything, to put it mildly, is good here. Then, of course, this is quite obvious that a lot of changes related to the transfer of many traditional economic activities to remote forms of implementation. They will also have their impact on the economic system. And then what is also extremely interesting is what's going on with the world economy, with the process of globalization. Will humanity be able to improve global governance, or will it face a setback in the globalization process? Those are only some questions which, to my mind, deserve being answered. And therefore, this is the main reason why we decided that it would be fine. It would be fine to have a series of seminars. We don't know how many, but what I can tell you is that today, Jamie, the initiator of the project, is the main speaker. The next seminar, which will take place in a week, at this very time on Tuesday, our main speaker is going to be Jacques Sapir from France. I have also some people who informed me about their willingness to be speakers at our seminar. Anton Moiseyev is one of them, and I would like to ask you to make your proposals as well. So now it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Jamie Galbraith, professor of the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs and also professor at the Department of Government, University of Texas at Austin. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And Sasha, yes, let me come to, hold on a second. All right. I'll go to share my screen here briefly. Should be it. There we are. All right. Let me say thank you very much. And it's a really a pleasure and a very great privilege to have a chance to speak with all of you today. I'm greatly honored by Sasha and Sergey and others who've taken up the suggestion that we hold these seminars and to be the first speaker in this series. What I want to do today is to assess the interaction between this pandemic and the structure of the economy, especially in the situation that we're facing in the United States. But to begin with, it seems appropriate to just to bring out some aspects of this phenomenon which are common to all of us, because it is a biological phenomenon with certain properties. And the two that are particularly important are basically the mathematical properties of the transmission coefficient, which in an uncontrolled situation is greater than 2, with a doubling time of just a few days. So this is a virus that spreads very rapidly in human populations and where in the normal situations. And secondly, the incubation period, which is typically around a couple of weeks. And when you take those two things together, the transmission coefficient is rather similar, essentially the same as the operation of an uncontrolled nuclear reaction under critical mass. And the explosive potential is very, very large. On the other hand, since it is largely human-to-human transmission, we have found that physical separation, so-called social distancing, is indeed an effective moderator, an effective depressant of the transmission coefficient. And so after a certain period of time following the implementation of draconian measures, we do tend to see in practically every case, I think in every case, a deceleration of the of the spread of the pandemic, the spread of the disease. And these are a couple of charts here that I came across a few days ago from a professor of geography at Oxford by the name of Danny Dorling, which plot on one axis the increase or decrease in deaths per day, and on the other the average number of deaths per day for each of the countries for which we have reliable data so far. And you can see essentially that in every case after several weeks following the imposition of essentially draconian social distancing measures, you see a bending of the curve and some deceleration of the pandemic. So what we know then is that the effectiveness of the response depends upon how quickly these measures are put in place. Countries that put them in place the most quickly have the benefit of a much lower casualty rate. And those that did not, or that were not as effective, suffer, and particularly the cases of the United States and France are very clear here, as well as Spain and Italy suffer from very, very much higher rates of fatalities from this. The cost of delay, therefore not so much the lengthening of the epidemic, but as I say, the number of casualties, the fact that cases are spattered across the landscape, and therefore there is a risk of the pandemic erupting in the subsequent period, and the need, therefore, for a substantially longer period of strict controls, which will affect the second part of the issue, which is the economic situation. I'll come to that very shortly. The performance of the United States was particularly poor in this pandemic, and I would attribute that to a number of factors of fairly long standing, all related essentially to a long-term decline in the competence of public authority in this country. They include, first of all, denial and dysfunction at the federal level. I think that's fairly obvious to anybody who's been observing and reading the news from the US in the recent weeks. But it's not a new phenomenon, and it's complicated by profiteering, which is essentially the influence of major lobbies over federal decision-making, and by electioneering, and by the fact that we're in an election cycle. And so considerations relating to politics played a role in the initial response to these developments. And secondly, the fact that the authority to act in this country is decentralized. It exists mainly at the state and also at the local level. That's where orders to stay at home, lockdown orders, have come from. These were applied unevenly and at varying moments with different criteria, which made it very hard for there to be a coordinated national response, and meant that in certain areas you had outbreaks that were due to the fact that people were congregating large numbers at various places well into the middle of March, and that made for an extra burden of contagion. And thirdly, the structure of the United States healthcare system, which, to be fair to it, absorbs about 18% of the GDP, as GDP was some months ago. But it was a system which was oriented toward specializations, toward the maladies of a fairly affluent population. It was largely privatized. It's substantially profit-centered, very specialized, and evolved, as I say, to meet the needs of the country as they exist in normal times, but very much away from the requirements of public health in the face of infectious diseases. It's a problem to which it was not engineered, for which it was not engineered, and for which the basic infrastructure was not maintained. In fact, was run down consistently over the past 40 years. And then finally, the fact that the country is highly globalized, highly financialized, that its manufacturing base and its corporate structure have been hollowed out over the last 4 decades, and therefore that the country has come to rely on global supply chains for a lot of basic goods, including medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, protective equipment, and all of that, which are then vulnerable to disruption and to countries who are suppliers prioritizing their own needs, and therefore we were left in a situation where we were desperately short of basic protective equipment in the early phases of this event. In sum, the United States was efficiently adjusted to the conditions that existed of an unequal, highly individualized, decentralized society, but by the same token, fragile, uncoordinated, and unsuited to dealing with a common threat. And the ideology of the free market, conservative social doctrine, which dictated decentralization of government functions, buttressed that system, obscured its vulnerability, and to the point of ignoring the scientific evidence and arguments that were being made, and political efforts to maintain a common defensive capacity, something which the country did have 30 or 40 years ago to a much greater extent than it does now. So, nevertheless, the initial crisis is, and I'll just go past one more chart here, which blows up the bottom part of this particular diagram to show the cases of Germany and China, the cases where effective measures were applied fairly early. There was a relatively quick movement to a declining rate of daily deaths, and in the Chinese case, effectively the suppression of the virus over a period of just about 6 or 8 weeks. So you see that as an example of the countries that have played so far the most effective defense against this pandemic, against those that did not. And so what I see here is 3 basic issues, or 3 phases in the life of this particular calamity. The first is a crisis phase, which we have basically been facing for the last month or so, with medical supplies, tests, protective equipment, hospital beds, ICU units, ventilators especially, things to deal with the crush of patients who come in the first wave at a time when hospitals are already basically occupied dealing with other things, and so they don't have extra capacity, and a great deal of disorganization and extra losses that are associated with not being prepared, including losses to the hospital staff because they're not adequately protected. Those things are, I won't say that they're fully under control, but they're in better shape than they were 3 or 4 weeks ago. At some level, you do get some adjustment, even if it's chaotic and disorderly and not as effective as it could have been. And it's also true that in spite of the weakness of the central government in coordinating response, the American population has, by and large, come into substantial compliance with the doctrines of social distancing. And so you're seeing at the municipal level, the state level, lockdowns, they're not wholly effective, but they are in fact working, and visibly you can see it from the diagram I showed in the first diagram, to decelerate the spread of the pandemic. But that just brings us to the second phase, which is the sustained effort that's required to keep the society in function. And that has to happen for quite a long time. It has to happen until one of two things occur. One is a therapy that's demonstrated to be effective, and the other is a vaccine. On a vaccine, we are told, we don't know if the therapy will emerge or not, but the vaccine is probably not likely to emerge for something like a year, maybe longer, maybe a little less, but that's the timeline that we've been told. And that problem, getting us through this next period, is basically an economist problem. It's not so much the medical problem. It's the problem of trying to hold the society together in an effective way for the length of time that's required to manage this phase of the epidemic. That's the second phase. The third phase, which I'll come to, is the aftermath. What happens after that? But during the containment phase, I would argue that there are two issues. One of them is the safety, security, and maintaining an adequate level of income sufficient to cover basic costs of the population that is locked down, that is practicing social distancing, that is under stay-at-home orders, that is essentially not essential to the life of the community, except insofar as it is necessary to keep people isolated from each other and break the chain of transmission of the disease. And that's, of course, a majority of the population at any given time. And the second issue is how to keep that population and everybody else adequately supplied, which is the question of supply chains and food and other essentials. But food is the big one, as well as public services, the utilities and the sanitation and everything else, which have so far not emerged as major problems, but over a long period of time, there are maintenance issues that have to be thought about as well. But food is the immediate one, and one which is really, to my mind, increasingly worrisome as time goes on, and I don't think it's been adequately addressed in the policy measures so far. So taking those two things, the safety and security is largely a matter of covering essential costs, and an economy where most people have obligations on their housing and obligations on their utilities. It's a matter of ensuring that they're able to stay securely where they are. Let's say blocking evictions and foreclosures and utility stoppages, getting utilities running again where they have been stopped, keeping communications lines open. And one finds that these measures have been implemented to a degree. In some places, we have moratoria in Los Angeles and New Jersey on evictions and foreclosures, and probably in other places as well. I haven't kept a full account. But over time, one has to worry about the sustainability of that, in part because public services depend upon the financing of state and local governments, and they depend upon sales and to some degree income taxes, which are not going to be they're going to come down very rapidly. So one has to worry about how the basic services are provided over time in an environment where the overall economy remains in kind of cold storage or a medically induced coma for a period of months into the future. So the system is set up to impose a very heavy degree of austerity bordering on collapse of services if nothing is done to federalize those costs. And so far, very little has been done. The major assistance is available to the state and local governments through the central bank, but that's on a loan basis. And it's unclear that the states and localities are in a position to take advantage of it because they're under constitutional requirements, local constitutional requirements, state constitutions, to maintain balance in their operating budget. So we're looking at a situation which is an unresolved crisis in development as this thing goes on. And then there's this question of the supply chain. We have ample food in the country. The country is a major producer of food, but the distribution and point of sale is an issue which is at least somewhat fragile. And this is largely a question of the fact that the workers who pick the crops and who distribute them and who sell them, people who man the checkout counters and provide security in the stores, are all very low paid, very badly treated workers. And they're now in essential positions where are also very dangerous because particularly those who are in direct contact with customers on a minute-to-minute basis, people manning cashier stands, for example. And this is potentially a problem in two respects. First of all, because people may not choose to stay in those jobs because we've already seen a number of fatalities in the grocery chain. Secondly, because customers may not be willing to come into stores if they feel they're contaminated. And there are also issues further up the supply chain, meat packing plants and other facilities where people work closely together, some of which have been closed because they've been vectors for the spread of the disease. Now, we haven't seen that as a major supply issue yet, but there's worrisome elements. And one of the worrisome elements is actually at the bottom of the food supply chain, food banks, which are basically charitable enterprises, and they have two problems. One is that they rely on donations from stores, which don't have inventory because customers have been clearing them out, and they rely on volunteers, many of whom are elderly, who aren't willing to go out and risk their lives in the situation where the disease is particularly fatal for elderly people. So we're running into problems. So far, there haven't been disastrous, but we had 10,000 people, for example, lined up for food in San Antonio the other day. And those supplies are not, there's not an infinite supply going through that channel. And you have a social stability problem if people simply can't find the food that they need. Protections are inadequate for that workforce. Managers have been acting as though they regard their workers as dispensable and that their customers will continue to trust the security of the stores. I don't think either assumption is particularly safe. So we'll see what will happen. It's not, as the months go by, it's something that worries me a great deal. Okay, let me turn and talk a little bit about the aftermath and what assumptions have been made in this country and I think elsewhere as well by prevailing authorities about what will happen once the containment phase has been carried out for a certain amount of time. I think the assumption of U.S. policymakers, both parties, has been that this will amount to a short break in economic activity, which can be followed by a fairly rapid return to the previous status quo, to the status quo ante. That assumption underlies, for example, the policy of providing loans or grants to major corporations, including things like airlines and the hotel industry, the policy of loans to small businesses, loans rather than grants, although they are to be forgiven if those businesses retain their workers over a certain period of time, and the so-called stimulus package, which is in payments to individuals, and I must say, in my view, unforgivably haphazard way through the tax system rather than much simpler ways, direct ways that were available to try and stimulate, and the word stimulate bothers me a great deal as a metaphor for what's required, consumer spending and get people back into the mode of consumption-driven economy. I don't regard these things as particularly sensible given the particular circumstances that this epidemic faces, and I can talk about that. And I think one telling sign that things are not going to be returning to where they were is the way in which unemployment insurance has been deployed. Unemployment insurance does permit firms to sever themselves from their workforce, and they've been doing so very massively. That's why the unemployment insurance claims have been at historic highs. And unemployment rates, of course, have gone up. What that signifies to me, that was the preferred way of dealing with getting people some cash so they can meet their costs, is that firms basically are thinking in terms of a massive shedding of their labor in any period going forward, and that we're not going to see an easy return to the previous employment rates. But that's not the only reason why the return to normal will not happen, in my view. I think that patterns of demand are going to be changed rather dramatically by these events because people will be poorer. They won't have the financial resources that they had 3 months ago, and because they will be more risk averse. They will not know how safe it is to do certain things, and they will be unwilling to risk themselves, and particularly if they've seen losses at the personal and family level. And they know that this disease is not something that just strikes old people or poor people, but it can strike anybody in rather serious ways. And because their values will change. They will have come to see certain things as less essential and other things as more essential. And that's, I think, already visible in the way people are reacting to this. People who have, people who have means, middle-class people, not merely the poor and the people who are most deeply distressed, but everybody. This pattern or changes will be reinforced as we move through the phase. And what I expect to happen, given the other weaknesses in the way the US is responding, is a pattern of lockdowns and outbreaks and lockdowns and outbreaks. That is to say, not things that can't be managed medically or that will overwhelm the system, but that will maybe more localized, but that will still remind people over the next year or 18 months that this thing hasn't gone away. And particularly if there's a seasonality to it and it lapses in the summer, comes back in the fall, we're just going to see people who may have wished to get over it discover that they can't really get over it, that they have to deal with this over a long period of time. And it's also fair to say that as that obstructs the return to normal that some would like to see, you have a kind of feedback loop in which each element of a non-recovery feeds into another one. Let's say spending feeds to incomes, incomes feed to tax revenues, and particularly to state and local services, their capacity and service provision, and then those things feed to unemployment and reduction in spending power. So the circle goes around. I can feel this coming in my own situation here. I work for a state university, and of course it depends to a degree on public support, and we have a legislative session which will be governed by the tax take in the state, and the state of Texas depends on sales taxes and oil prices, and neither of those things is particularly happy right now. So looking forward, I see two really major issues that need to be dealt with, aside from the patterns of behavior. One of them is the resolution of debts. There's going to be a great pileup of unpaid obligations, business obligations, personal obligations, mortgages, student loans, consumer credit, you name it. There's going to be unpaid bills, and people's incomes having fallen, they will get deferrals and a certain degree of forbearance. But at the end of the day, the question is that incomes are not, even if they go back to their previous level, they're not going to make up the losses of a number of months of unemployment, perhaps longer, for millions and millions of people. And so you're going to see a situation that will have to be resolved one way or another, either in the interest of the creditors, which is what happened after the last great financial crisis, in which case we had millions of foreclosures and people put out on the street. The assumption or the statement being that they shouldn't have taken those mortgages in the first place. That, it seems to me, is going to be a very difficult argument to sustain in the face of a pandemic, which is a common threat, and in the face of behavior which was mandated by the public sector. That is to say, people staying at home and staying away from their jobs and being laid off because they needed to do that for public health are not going to be so happy about losing their houses or anything else to being burdened for the rest of their lives by enormous debts. So it seems to me that a resolution that resets the financial relations in this country and therefore reorganizes the financial system particularly is something which is going to have to be on the table. And if it isn't, there's going to be a lot of social conflict coming out of this going forward. And then the other issue, which is, I think, very little thought has been given to, is how the economy and the society will be reorganizing themselves in the aftermath of this, in the long-term aftermath. It's obvious that we're going to have to make, if we're going to be prepared for another one, not be immobilized as we have been, very major additional investments, permanent investments in maintaining a public health infrastructure that has not been present in this country. We have to have people available to manage the future of this particular virus, and testing, monitoring, payment for the care, all of these things will have to be dealt with as public policy issues going forward for a substantial period of times. But even more important than that is that the reorganization of life, just for safety, to maintain distancing as required, is going to affect unbelievable range of things. It will affect every restaurant, which basically make their money by packing people in on the weekends. It will affect, of course, theaters and bars and cafes. It will affect schools. The density of classrooms will be an issue, and will affect all kinds of cultural and political gatherings. It will affect the way we conduct elections. It already is affecting that. And in each case, And this is not to mention the obvious things like airlines and cruise lines and so forth, and hotels and vacation destinations and theme parks and all kinds of things which people are simply not going to want to patronize as they have in the past. And you can see those industries folding up or reorganizing to serve people in a much less let's say, mass way. And it's very hard to see how they meet their fixed costs on their current models that way. So I see a massive reorganization of a great part of the economy as being already baked into the reaction to this development. And that means that we're going to have to worry about how to provide employment and incomes and sustenance and useful things to do for very many millions of people who will not be going back in the long run to the industries that they've been part of, the sectors they've been part of going forward. And I don't think we've begun to think about that. I think there's been an assumption. Everybody's imaginations have been limited by the immediate crisis and by their own past experience and by what happened after the last financial crisis and what happened after 9/11 for that matter, to think that things will return to normal. But this is different. This really is different. I don't think they will. Will capitalism as such meet the challenge? My sense, and just to conclude on this, is that both our own history in the West and history of the Great Depression and its aftermath, and the recent history in Asia of dealing with this pandemic, particularly the successful experience of China, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, all suggested that the capitalism that we've experienced, the capitalism of the last 40 years, decentralization and deregulation is not viable in the aftermath of this. We'll have a new system. I don't think that, obviously I think there are alternatives to state socialism, although they're really very much in the historical model of the New Deal, which was such an alternative. It was the American answer to the Russian Revolution, in effect, and was a workable model with an large element of public sector organization and initiative that restructured the country in an important way, but without the kind of revolutionizing that occurred elsewhere. But those models, the time to rediscover them is now. If we don't rediscover them soon and begin to think about how to make them happen, we may lose the chance. So on that rather, let's say, grim, but I think determined note, I'll stop and open it up for your comments and observations. I'm very anxious to hear. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Jamie. It was great. Thank you so much. Very interesting. And now, please, who would like to put questions or to make comments, dear colleagues? Alexei Kireev, yes, please. Hi, Alexei.
Yes. Good morning and good afternoon, actually. Hello to everybody.
Good
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the great initiative, and thank you, James, for this excellent presentation on a very topical subject. I have a fundamental question of the approach to the overall crisis. In my view, we are talking about mainly a supply side disruption, whereas all measures, or most of the measures which are being taken, are designed to handle demand side disruptions. So how would you reconcile this situation? In my view, when there are issues related to provisioning, to global value chains, and commodities cannot reach shelves in stores, things like reducing the interest rate, increasing government expenditure, taxes. What would be your take on this, please?
Well, it's a question which has had me pulling my hair out because I'm in complete sympathy, such hair that I have remaining, complete sympathy with your point. And what we saw in the initial response to this was largely a set of ideas and a rhetoric that was inherited from the last major event 12 years ago, from the great financial crisis, which was dealt with, to the extent it was dealt with, by pumping money into the system at various levels. But you don't fight a war by writing checks. It's just not the way you do it. This is much more akin to the crisis of 1941-42, and that it requires a mobilization, an organized effort to deal with very specific problems, and a control of the relationship between the demand and the supply side. That you want to have enough purchasing power distributed broadly and fairly so that people can get the essential supplies, but you don't want to flood the system with purchasing power without controls, because then you get panic buying and destocking of shelves, and you end up disrupting the supply chain by having the wrong balance between purchasing power and demand. And you, of course, don't want people, you want people to be safe in their homes. You don't want them to be short of the rent or be subject to foreclosures. All kinds of supply side and structural issues that have to be dealt with. And those were not given the attention that they needed, because people are stuck in this notion that the solution to a problem of unemployment, for example, is to throw money into the economy. Well, it's very problematic when there's nobody in the factories, nothing being produced, and the trade routes are disrupted, and the distributors aren't even distributing things which are not essential. They're not medical supplies, cleaning supplies, or food. So you're really running a big risk by that kind of reaction. And I do think that if we had a longer historical perspective, we'd understand that this is not the only economic problem. And if we understood Keynes, we would understand that that Keynes was never a pure demand side person. That was a post-war textbook interpretation of him. Keynes, of How to Pay for the War, was very focused on the balance between the civilian supply and the total effective demand for it. And this was also, I mean, I have to say, this is an issue with which I have a kind of bred in the bone familiarity, because this was my father's issue in 1941. He was in charge of prices in the United States and civilian supplies. And so he had, this understanding of what it took to get a fair distribution of the essentials and to get people to hold any extra cash that they were earning because of the war effort. And not to try and put it into black markets or into commodities or anything else, but rather just to hold the bonds until they could become valid sources of purchasing power in the post-war period, which is effectively what happened and why that was a successful enterprise, a successful operation. This does not have the hallmarks of a well-considered operation from that point of view. So yes, exceedingly important way of putting the issue.
Thank you. Please, colleagues, you are welcome to make comments or ask questions. Viktor Meirovich, you are welcome.
Okay. Hi, Jimmy. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you, could you compare USA and Sweden strategies to fight coronavirus?
Yeah, I have only had a passing briefing on the Swedish situation. The Swedes have, my understanding is a sympathetic understanding by a non-Swede resident in Stockholm, who's a close friend of mine, former student, is that they are playing a long game on the argument that they can't hold a strict lockdown for a very long period of time. But on the other hand, they do have a much stronger public health sector and a much more, let's say, responsive and cooperative population, so that they can be less stringent about the lockdown rules. That is a gamble on their part, and whether it will pay off is unclear. Sweden has so far a high mortality rate, but that's also somewhat questionable because, among other things, they have very accurate reporting, and so we are missing a lot of deaths in this country. People aren't tested, people dying in nursing homes, and so forth. It's unclear. I mean, what we're seeing in the official statistics is not the full extent of the lethality of this thing. And the Swedes are in much better shape, and they're also they're from the point of view of knowing what they've got, and they've also got there's a tendency for them to update the numbers very rapidly, so that also tends to show a higher rate of lethality than would be strictly the case under full comparison with other countries. So that's my understanding. Whether their gamble will pay off or not, we shall see. And at this point, the jury's out. But they do have certain advantages: of stronger public health orientation and a very attentive population, and a government which is is viewed as trustworthy, which is at the federal level a big problem here. At the state and local level, I have to say here, in a large share of the cases, the governments are viewed as trustworthy. Certainly, I feel that way about my local government. You can see New York, California, other major states. The governors, I think, acquired a lot of respect, and people are paying attention. They're the ones who have the power to impose orders on people. But of course, the lines across state boundaries are porous, and we would be obviously much better off if the federal government were stepping up to its responsibilities, which it has manifestly not done.
Thank you. Please.
I see Jacques Sapir has his hand up.
Oh, he's here. Jacques. Hi, yeah. Jacques. You are welcome. Please.
Okay. Thank you. Well, welcome, friends. First, one observation and then two questions to Jimmy. The first observation was on your first graph. I have the feeling that because we don't have good statistics on this, this graph is more or less representing apple and orange. Let me just give you an example. For more than 3 weeks, we didn't have in France statistics about death of people in old age houses, which we call EHPAD. And then all these statistics came at once. After that, some days they are coming, some others they are not. As an end result, I'm not sure that the French statistic could be compared with a statistic of Italy, because Italy has not the same institution like EHPAD that we have in France. And by the way, the day-to-day flow of death is probably not exactly represented by statistics we have. This is the first observation. Then my two questions. The first question is, do you think that the problem with the containment economy and also the end of containment, which will be for France by May 11th, in the containment economy, at first, this is mainly a supply side affair. Just to say that first the disruption of the supply chain, then the consequences of the lockdown are causing the most damage to the economy. But the closer we are coming to the end of containment, the more the demand side will be important. And the problem is that we don't know, I don't know myself, and I assume that a lot of people don't know in France how we will manage this move from a kind of supply side restriction economy onto a kind of demand-sided restriction economy. And this is one of the main problems. The second question, as far as I've well understood you, because sometimes the sound was not very good, if I have well understood what you said, the social system in each country is a very important part of the resilience of the country to this pandemic. And would you agree with this statement? And will you agree too with the statement that some more or less collectivist culture country, like East Asian country, South Korea, Taiwan, and the like, are, for some historical reason, much more resilient than our or more liberal-minded Western countries?
Okay, well, there are three issues here. On the statistics, I'm simply drawing on the graphics of Professor Dorling. Those are moving averages, so I don't think the day-to-day fluctuations are a major issue. But I take your point that as in the U.S., there are going to be, the death tolls are going to be understated for countries where there are, and this is true for us as well. But that I think still, since we have, basically the records of that's officially recorded, the trends in those are indicative of the effectiveness of the social distancing measures. So I think that point remains valid, and its consistency across all the diagrams strikes me as a very telling commonality. It's just something that tells you about the biology of this disease and the kinds of measures that do in effect break the chain of transmission. On your second question about the need for demand management in the case as we open up, well, I guess my view is that the promise of opening up is something that political leaders keep offering, and then they discover that it has to be delayed. We're not going to see. I would be astonished if any serious effort to open up happens in the early days of May, or by the middle of May. This is, we may get some instructions that certain things can go back to work and so forth, but you're going to see that done very carefully, and where mistakes are made and you begin to get an uptick, because this transmission mechanism is still there in cases, and there's no treatment, and then you'll see things closing down again. That already happened in China. I think either they opened up movie theaters and then boom, they shut them down because they saw this as a danger that they didn't want to run. So I'm inclined to leave the demand management issues to a little later in the process, because unless the economies there's such an imbalance that people are essentially panic buying in the grocery stores, it's hard to see what there is to buy until there's until the services are once again being provided. So this is an issue, but it's an issue that is let's say a little later in time. And then the third question, which I think is very clear, that there are countries which handled this in a much more effective way. And I showed that. The graph shows it very clearly for China, but I also mentioned Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, and some other cases. And what's going on there? I don't think it's, strictly speaking, a cultural question, although that's part of it. It is a set of, first of all, was a science-based approach. There were strong public health systems. Korea has like 12 hospital beds per 10,000 or so. It's 2.4 in the United States. So you're looking at countries which have provisioned themselves. It's also interior supply chains. These are, of course, the countries that do the manufacturing for a lot of these things in the world. And so they were able to take care of their own needs. Although China imported a lot in January. I can tell you, our drugstores were cleaned out in January as people, including ourselves, shipped things to China. I have family in China, so we were attentive to the needs there very early. And then, of course, as they reopened their production, they've supplied the United States. Planes are coming in from China all the time now, as well as other parts of the world. They've come into Italy, of course. They have medical teams in Italy, as do the Cubans. And there's been aid, of course, from Russia. We had a very large, very welcome Antonov 124 come into New York the other day with a very moving greeting from the air traffic controller, which was on television here. So these things are, the fact is that the global cooperation is still a very essential piece of getting control of the crisis. But on the question of the Chinese response, the combination of an emphasis on supporting the medical personnel, on the bravery of the people who flew in, like 40,000 of them flew into Wuhan, flew in from all parts of the country. 1,200 from my wife's home province of Fujian. The greetings when they came back were just moving beyond words. And the organization of the society, which is an artifact of the system, neighborhood committees and so forth, and very quickly had secure arrangements around apartment complexes and effective delivery of food and quarantining, and all these things were socially organized in an exceedingly serious way. And this turned out to be the resilient and effective approach. Now, in the U.S. and in other Western societies, but particularly in the U.S., there are some advantages. We live spread out. We drive cars. That's socially isolating. We are socially isolated compared to a lot of other people. This turns out to have some advantages in dealing with this disease. So, let's not exaggerate the contrast. And as you can see, that while we suffered huge losses, but unnecessarily, but slow start and inadequate preparation. The turning points are roughly on the same time horizon, and if you stick to the program, you can get the thing down. The problem is keeping it down and keeping it under control for the long time that will take, either to have a tested, effective, available therapy, or to have the kind of let's say micro monitoring, surveillance, which some people are talking about, which I don't have much confidence in. That happens in Taiwan. Taiwan, you let your phone battery run down and the police are there in a few minutes to remind you to charge the thing up so they can keep track of contacts. They have big data going like it's never been seen. I find that hard to believe that could be implemented in the U.S. But we'll see. That's a second approach. And the third question is a vaccine, and the timeline for a vaccine is, and we hear sometimes occasional reports that there might be something this summer, but more likely it's a year. And so depending on how that plays out, we're looking at a time frame in which we have to manage this actively for an extended period of time. And that's where it seems to me we really need to be thinking right now, how you get through that. Make sure that the food supply chains hold up, that people, we get the kind of working relations with all the people we now absolutely depend upon. I know there's a big issue in Spain with agricultural workers, in France too, coming in from North Africa, not available. These people who have been very badly treated are now, we will regret the arrangements that we've been using to cheapen the price of food for a long time.
Thank you, Jamie. Jamie, may I ask you a question too? I would like to know your position on the importance of financial constraints and struggle with pandemic. I mean, in the short run and in the long run as well.
Well, we've quickly realized we swept away a body of doctrine about financial constraints. There's still the odd op-ed columnist in the Washington Post who prates about the budget deficit, but we just added a couple of trillion to it, and there's no sign that. Obviously interest rates have gone down, not up, because everybody's in the flight to quality. So the basic rule is, if you control your borders and you're not dependent upon external borrowing, you can finance yourself. The Japanese, the Chinese, ourselves are not going to have any problem with that. The British are not going to have any problem. In the Eurozone, it's a problem, all right? The Eurozone has a problem of joint governance, and so you have to get the approval of the Germans and the Dutch, and good luck with that. I think the Italians basically got rested at some approval by essentially the threats of violence and exit from the Eurozone, or exit from the European Union. I mean, the situation was sufficiently desperate, and I say more power to them, but this has been a complication of the European situation with which I was vividly exposed in 2015 in Greece. And it's going to be still a major problem going forward unless there's somehow change of attitude and a change of ideas and a real serious commitment to reforming the structure. with capital controls in place, a country and an autonomy, or in the case of Russia, sufficient financial reserves, which appear to be the case, you do what you have to do. It's a wartime situation. The basic rule, Keynes's doctrine on this was anything you can do, you can afford. Once it's done, it's done. It can't be taken away from you. You have to meet the challenge, and if you don't meet it, you can't say that financial constraints were the reason. The reason was a lack of will, or a lack of administrative capacity, or a lack of real resources. Those things are there, then the challenge can be met. And this is not, in the scheme of things, this is not 1941. This is either us or you. Those were much bigger days. This is a manageable problem with a casualty rate which is tragic, but it's not it's not earth-shattering. It's really a challenge to our economic capacity, our organizational capacity, our medical capacity, and those challenges can be met if we organize ourselves properly to do it.
Jamie, you mentioned capital controls. This is one of my favorite topics. How important are they?
Well, I can tell you that in 1995, when I was serving as chief technical advisor to the State Planning Commission of the People's Republic of China on a UN project, I sort of got the idea that they were, I don't know how, it sort of wafted in the air that they were considering liberalizing the capital account. And I called up Robert Eisner, a great economist, and also another economist, Jane Jurista, a very, very excellent person who's still with us. And I got them both to China on the explicit promise that they would lecture and persuade the Chinese leadership not to liberalize the capital account. And I believe that had a significant effect on China's ability to weather the Asian crisis that came along 2 years later. I was given a very nice xie by my Chinese friends when that lesson was was driven home by circumstances. And of course, it has made an enormous difference, it seems to me, to have that control. And of course, in '97, the Thais imposed capital controls, and at various times the Chileans and others have. This is permitted under the IMF Charter. It's an important tool of policy. It was a major tool, expected to be, and continued in Western Europe into the 1970s. And so, when you need to use them, use them. These are measures which are part of the toolkit. There is certainly no theological reason or certainly no scientific reason why they shouldn't be part of the toolkit.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Please, colleagues, you are welcome to make comments or to ask questions. Юрий Кабанов, Юрий Михайлович, приветствую вас. You are welcome, Юрий Михайлович.
I have a question about perspectives. So for a moment, it is not clear that the containment will be over soon. Namely, I believe that it is too optimistic, May 11, for example, in France. But so seemingly, we shall live for quite a long period in the situation where epidemic, formally we are not actually in the epidemic, in the definition of formal definition, because epidemic is 5% of population ill, so we have not this high figure. Anyway, the danger is real. And so I do not think that the population will be happy to be outside. And so a lot of activities probably will be in a certain way under containment. So this means that several branches of economy probably will suffer from changes. For example, the education. At the moment, there were a lot of efforts to use remote education. And especially in Moscow, Professor Kuzminov, that president of Higher School of Economics, is an adept of such move in education. Now, the coronavirus situation, it seems that more and more the education will be in a remote way. So this means that professors may be equipped with good equipment, and so similarly students. So this means that instead of paying huge money of tuition fee, they can get education for a much lower price, because you see that it is highly subsidized by the state, especially say in France or in Russia. So this means that many fields can be as in a perspective working in the situation of containment. What do you think about other changes in the economy? Is it real or just is my speculation? Thank you.
Well, I think a great many things will be reconsidered, always are, in the wake of a crisis. It was true after 2008 as well. Many people, businesses, as they start up again, they consider how to save labor. And in this situation, ever more important, because the more you can replace people with machinery, the less contagion you're responsible for, the less risk you have as an employer. So I think there's no doubt that one of the reasons why we're seeing such a big response, people going on unemployment insurance, is their employers are not expecting to have them back. And that's, I think that's just, we ought to be planning that going forward, which is going to leave a major employment problem to be dealt with by some other sector, the public sector in most cases. So essentially by the public sector or some decentralized version of the public sector. It's got to be providing employment for people. Otherwise, you're going to have just armies of unemployed people, and that's not a sustainable situation. Employment, a job guarantee is a sustainable situation under, at least if it's managed properly. But you know, that's a question of the internal distribution organization going forward. It's going to be a major, major challenge. In terms of education, I think this is a key example. I'm teaching 3 classes this semester. They're all moved online. They've been online since the middle of March. We discover that this is in fact for what I do, which does not require laboratory equipment or anything beyond the reading and writing, it's a very efficient and effective way of proceeding. And it turns out that under the circumstances where students don't have access to each other physically, they're not on campus, and that their concentration on their classes has really been quite remarkable. I've been deeply impressed by their responsiveness, in fact, in the case of mine. I don't know what your experiences are. Yeah, I can easily see that this will cause a great deal of the physical plant of the higher education sector to be functionally redundant. There are lots of things that are in universities there are many things which do require people to be there, but it won't be used because of social distancing. It's very hard to see how the sports facilities can be used. They're accustomed to packing people in by the thousands or tens of thousands. Having people socially distanced in a stadium is not going to be quite the same experience. So it's very hard to see how that works. Theaters and you name it. And of course, physical classrooms will be reconfigured. And so that too is going to mean that the physical plant is going to be, in many ways, it's going to be a while before it returns, if it ever returns, to something like what we had before. And then meanwhile, we'll be soldiering on online. And you're quite correct that the cost of doing that is a lot lower, even if you decide you're going to keep up professors' salaries, which is another question that will have to be considered. So I don't know what the future is in that respect, but I think we're in the same boat as restaurateurs, and with the exception of the fact that you could make a well, you have to make an argument for some kind of social support for all of these sectors if you want to maintain them. The business of fitting a different customer flow into a structure of fixed costs is just going to be a huge, huge challenge, because we have built ourselves a world that requires a lot of people doing things in order to make ends meet. And if the flow through is less, the income is less, and the costs are not going to be met, somebody's going to have to make up the difference, or these things are going to deteriorate and shut down. It's not a new experience. It's happened, and it happened with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, and it happened in the Great Depression. And it's going to be a problem that we're going to face with now. On the bright side, if we do manage to do things properly, we'll have environmental benefits. It's quite clear. That we could have a lot less commuting in this country, for example. It's a lot less fuel consumption, a lot less air pollution, carbon emissions, this kind of thing, because the systems that exist for doing things remotely are, obviously many, many times more efficient in their use of resources. There are some aspects of this which are not entirely bad, but adjusting to it has got to be a challenge that I don't think we've been thinking about seriously enough. And that as the containment phase goes on is something we're really going to have to put our minds to and be talking about, so that people who are in decision-making positions will not be under the assumption that things will go back to normal.
Thank you, Jamie. Dear colleagues, who would like to say something or ask questions? Or
There's Alexei.
Sorry?
I see Alexei's hand.
Alexei's hand.
Yes.
Alexei Pavlovich.
Right there. Next to Sergey on my screen, but I don't know where he is on yours.
Alexei.
Алексей Анатольевич, не. Алексей Анатольевич, не Алексей Павлович.
Это не Алексей Павлович, нет. Я свое спросил уже.
Сергей Рогов, you know him.
Алексей Анатольевич. Alexei Anatolyevich, did I...
Микрофон включи.
Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now? Okay, let me start with something which has been touched upon in the course of the discussion, and it is distancing. I think that the current situation will stimulate what was developing and accelerating before the pandemic. It is the principle of being remote and distancing. For example, such things as Internet of Things, 5G, cloud technologies, remote medicine, etc., etc. They will take the boost due to the experience which we are going through now. But there are certain spheres of our life which I do not think are going to benefit from distancing, and this is the sphere of education. From my point of view, there is a certain niche in the sphere of education, both secondary and higher, which can accommodate certain novelties and reforms in distancing technologies, in remote technologies. But I think that we should be very cautious in not making reforms in education, going beyond common reason, because we can take the education as a technical way of transmitting your knowledge and information. But what is even more important in the process of education, from my point of view, is not just the technical thing of transmitting your knowledge, but something what can be done only if you have a certain person in front of you, your teacher, a person whom you see not just virtually, but physically. The education as something what make you more skillful and knowledgeable, not just in factual size of something, but in terms of morality, in terms of values, in terms of how people behave, etc., etc. So I hope very much that the high school in Russia will not experience a boost in remote education due to this crisis. You know, as we say in Russia, for example, reforms vary, reformie рознь. So I hope that reforms in the Russian system of education, in the Russian sphere of medicine, in the Russian sphere of science, will not go in the wrong direction due to certain lessons and experience of this pandemic. And then several more general notes. We know very well that there is a very strong political side or political aspect of this pandemic, of this crisis. And I would like to say a few words very briefly. Firstly, it seems to me that the factor of the pandemic does not run counter to the global trends in the world economy, which we were witnessing before COVID-19. The world economy was slowing down before the pandemic. And many experts were predicting what the next trigger is going to be to make the thing explode. Then the relative poverty and social inequality were going up before the pandemic. The geopolitical and geo-economic competition were speeding up before the pandemic. The plunge of oil prices, the reasons for it were not a consequence of the pandemic, but in fact predated it. So my idea is that the coronavirus is just putting in sharp relief the problems which had been accumulating and accelerating before the current crisis. My next point is that COVID-19 is not a black swan, but it is a white swan which caught us off guard. In the same way as heavy snow each winter surprised us. We know that winter is coming, but when it starts snowing, we are very surprised. I think that COVID-19 has underlined the role of a nation state, and at the same time has proved that there should be a global reply to many risks and threats. But at the same time, what do we witness? We are witnessing that the world is drifting apart, and probably with even faster pace than it was until recently. It seems to me that everybody is losing because of the pandemic, but there will be those who will lose less than others. And I think that, for example, China will lose less and the United States will lose more. But this is a zero-sum game in terms of that everybody is losing. And also, it seems to me that COVID-19 should inflict more damage to economic and political neoliberalism. I think that this crisis is not for the benefit of both the political and economic school of neoliberalism. Wrapping up, my question is the current downturn in the world economy the beginning of something much more serious and profound, or just something what we will experience in the next months, and then the situation will come back to the groove? From my point of view, probably the way out is that the world as a whole should become less prosperous from the consumption point of view, but at the same time more equal, meaning with more social justice and equality, at least relative equality, than currently is the case. So this is my take.
Well, I
please, Jamie.
essentially have nothing there that I would strongly disagree with. I think that this is a fundamental change in the world situation. I agree with you that it was, in some sense, not unpredictable. There were prior experiences, and I agree that the relative performance of different systems has been really tested by this, and that the neoliberal model, which had been eroding the social coherence of the United States for a long time, a country which emerged from the post-war period as a fairly coherent and functional state, has really been showing the fragility of a deregulated and decentralized system. And that was a major part of the point I was making earlier. Whereas it quite contrast with China and other parts of Asia. I take the point that was made on the chat box about Taiwan's status, and since I'm married to a national of the PRC from across the straits in Fujian, I'm very much on board with the Shanghai Communique, just for the record. The reality is that countries which had the better capacity to respond, more coherent and more rapid action, ability to enforce the social restrictions and to keep people basically safe and sound during this period, got through this much more rapidly, and we are still at best halfway through in the United States. So we have a lot of sorrow still ahead, and at the end of it, we're going to have a management problem because we're a very big country and very spread out. That will continue to be with us for a long, long time. So I think all of that does say that that you've had. Under these conditions, the American model has not handled it very well. As for the world economy, I think you can see adjustments and changes that will be made. There will also be major debt questions that will be in the aftermath of this, and there will be it will be an opportunity to build a more just and coherent world. Whether that opportunity will be taken is still very much an open question. I can tell you that there will, internally in certain countries, and including in the US, there'll be some major winners. People who sold the stock market short in February did exceedingly well. And there were some, and the records were in the order of more than $300 billion of gains from short sellers just before the crash of the markets. Those people are going to be out prowling for distressed assets in the US and around the world after this is over. And if you have you could have a major increase in inequality and a major decrease in security, a major increase in precarity and homelessness and food insecurity and everything else, and in violence and in all kinds of social pathologies and drug addiction and despair, mental health issues and everything else that goes with that, if we don't handle this correctly. So it's a huge challenge. And what I tell my students is that it's up to them. It's their generation, and this is the problem they're going to have to deal with. And all I can do is help them sort of understand what's in front of them now, which is something which has. I mean, it's going to be a challenge for that generation, but on the other hand, every generation has to prove itself somehow. Those maybe ours spent a long time in, particularly in the U.S., not being faced with challenges of this scale, but the next generation won't escape it. They already knew that. They had climate change on their plate, and they have to deal with that. Now they've got to deal with something much more immediate and urgent, and the problem is right in their laps right now.
Thank you, Jamie. Mr. Wang Zilu from China would like to say a few words. Yes, please do.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
Speak on the light. I'm not leaving you.
All right.
Hello, Mr. James. Thank you very much for giving us a very interesting report today. I'm very interested in it. As a Chinese, I want to tell you, Taiwan is not a country. It is a province of China. Maybe this history you don't know. I want to tell you. Since the outbreak of COVID pandemic, a large number of people have paid a huge price for it. Many companies have gone bankrupt. Many people have lost their jobs, and the demand for energy has also been reduced. In short, it has caused a lot of inconvenience to people's lives. It is still spreading rapidly. No, I have some questions. Can you tell me, can the COVID pandemic situation in the United States affect its status as the world's largest economy? At the same time, will the decline of the world's economy affect the overall adjustment of the world's energy structure and demand? Second question. When will Russia effectively control the COVID pandemic and people can work and live normally? Thank you very much.
I'm not sure I got the last question. The middle question had to do with the U.S. status as the world hegemon. And I think the trends in that, what's happening in that is visible to everybody. So one can see that for many decades now, that position has been stressed by, let's just say, an improvident use of the military power that the U.S. has had, and one can see very clearly the limits to that power in practice, and one can also see now in the limits of the world's willingness to be led. That requires a great deal of trust and confidence to entrust any particular country with that responsibility, and it's not hard to see why a great many countries have decided, not just in this administration, but perhaps especially in this one, that the U.S. Position isn't going to be again what it was in the period from 1945 into the 1970s. So I'll just leave it. I'll leave it at that. I think these things don't require elaboration. What I already said was that in response to this particular pandemic, we're seeing a test of economic models, and some are better suited to dealing with it, and some are not. In the U.S. case, we we've not got a record here that we hold up before anybody at the moment.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
Да, yes.
Дашь мне слово?
Да, yes, Sergey Rogov, please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Jamie, for a very interesting presentation, and I think it's a good discussion. And maybe thanks to the coronavirus, we are able to talk without paying a lot of money to travel.
Indeed.
And collect people. And I in particular enjoy participating in the discussion where I can smoke my cigarettes, which otherwise
I noticed that.
would be prohibited.
Which is bad.
I think that, well, of course, well, we cannot.
I chide you remotely.
Those who don't smoke and don't drink die absolutely healthy. That's an old Russian expression. Кто не курит и не пьет, тот здоровеньким помрет. Except that probably he will die from the coronavirus. I think it's too early to predict the outcome of the present crisis, and it's an open-ended process, but it seems to me, and the discussion and your presentation today proves it, that when it's over, there will be no return to the status quo. There will be no return to business as usual. There will be some irreversible changes in the social life, in the economic life, in political life, and in the military area. I want to talk a little bit about the last point, and you already mentioned the military issue in your previous answer. We experienced since the administration of George W. Bush a return to the arms race. The US defense expenditures were growing pretty much until President Obama, and under Donald Trump, again, well, the military expenditures jumped quite impressively. And at the same time, the Trump administration continued to pressure European allies in the NATO to spend more on defense, the 2% of the GDP or whatever. But the present situation, I think, may very seriously change this trend. Because, well, with this huge federal government budget deficit, which is bigger than any time since the Second World War, right? And more additional expenditures probably will be appropriated within the next several weeks. So the federal government debt in the United States will be enormous. According to the OECD numbers, the United States already spent something like 20% of the GDP trying to pour money on this crisis. And with most of the European countries, it's the same. And that means that probably this financing of the new arms race will be seriously challenged. Already there is a debate in your country. What are the true national security priorities? Why the United States, which spent so much on defense, turned out to be helpless when it was attacked by the coronavirus. And there are people who are arguing that, well, the real security threats are not, well, the threat from China and Russia and the requirement to maintain dual containment of the great powers, which the Trump administration proclaimed, but challenges like the global climate change and the health, and that would require much more effort in the post-crisis period. And I wonder, what's your opinion? Will the defense expenditures be frozen or maybe reduced, or despite all those developments which you and we all discussed today, this very dangerous arms race will continue? What's your opinion about it?
Okay, it's a very good question, and I wish I had a knowledgeable answer of how this will play out politically. I'll say, first of all, that that whatever happens, I don't think the financial aspects of it will be dominant. I mean, one thing that seems to be the immediate political impact of what just happened, the legislation that was passed, is a kind of recognition that that there is no financial constraint to speak of. There's no. There may be supply and demand imbalances, and there may be inflationary or deflationary pressures as a result of what happened. But the federal government can write the checks, and people will use the dollar. So it's not. So I don't see why the defense budget would be one way or another affected by that. What will be affected, if there is a capacity for strategic thinking in the country, is a sense of what is the mission and why are we spending these funds on things which are demonstrably not effective. We've discovered that aircraft carriers, which are very powerful weapons, are nevertheless vulnerable to the virus, and one of them is, at least temporarily incapacitated at the moment by an outbreak, which caught a lot of attention in this country just a few days ago. And we're also, learning that we've learned over the years that in a variety of situations, the projection of the power is vulnerable to let's say, much less expensive and more effective countermeasures, and that's true. We've discovered this in South Asia, and the Middle East, Southwest Asia, the Middle East, and so forth. And that's just a reality that we have not yet been able to assimilate, and as a result, we're continuing to spend a great deal of money on networks of bases that are vulnerable, on fleets that are that are of questionable effectiveness in any serious confrontation, and the advantages are increasingly on let's say on the defensive with countries and regions that are operating from their home bases and using technologies and local resources that are suited to the particular circumstances. Will we have a capacity to reassess what we did in Afghanistan, what we did in Iraq, the confrontation in the Middle East and elsewhere? And I don't need to mention other places you're more than familiar with. But I don't know. The answer to that is I don't know. We have not yet done it. And there is an enormous tendency to double down in this country on a particular set of doctrines. So I spent 20 years with an organization called Economists for Peace and Security. Before that, it was ECAR, Economists Allied for Arms Reduction. My old friend Stanislav Menchikov was a counterpart, and Sasha was others were involved in that. And this was something where we tried to get reassessment of what our real national security requirements are, and you're overridden by a variety of lobbies and a variety of strategic doctrines. So this is something which is up in the air at the moment. I can't give you I wish I could give you an optimistic answer that we will move to a period where we reassess the realities of the world and come to terms and have a cooperative engagement to deal with this issue and to deal with climate change and to deal with human development issues going forward. All these things seem to me would be much more constructive, but obviously many obstacles in the way. I do have to respond to Chen He, who asked whether I'm willing to follow the lieutenant governor of the great state of Texas out the door and put my life on the line. I suppose one answer would be after him, But the real answer would be that whatever risks I might be willing to take personally, I'm completely sure that my wife will keep me from any serious exposures that are at least any avoidable ones will be avoided, because I'm operating under strict domestic discipline, and it's not my personal authority that's at issue here.
Thank you, Jamie. Yes, we have about how many? 10 minutes, yes, Jamie?
I'm sorry, can I ask a question?
Yes,
Sergey, yes.
Sergey Shal,
Yeah.
yes.
Hello. Jamie, I remember one country where you were there in the period of crisis. And the country was small enough, and the country was suffering a lot. And then crisis, there was another crisis, of migration crisis, where Turkish flooded the country, but it sustained. How it happened? The situation, well, for me, it's just a magic. I don't know the magician who did it, but it seems to me that they don't suffer. And you know this country, the country is Greece. You were there. You witnessed how they were in crisis, and a very big crisis. And then they appeared as maybe it is a more dependent, the mobilization of the country, of the people, more dependent of on the specific features, peculiarities of the population, their psychology, their morality, their, well, I don't know, the integrity. Because if compared the China and Spanish, Italians, Spanish people, so there is something which maybe pushes the Chinese forward to overcome the ordeals, the difficulties. And it's not an economy only. And then the second question for me, what should we do? Should we, in case of crisis, save the big corporation, the big banks, or we must concentrate our attention on the smaller and medium business structures, to whom we should address? Because each and every crisis has new, absolutely new specific features as compared with the previous one. And speaking about the outcome and well, what can happen thereafter, we must look to the history. What happened there? How it could be? Were we right to save the country using this or that way? So just two questions. Jamie, could you answer me?
Well, to come
Your
to
views.
Yep.
Your views.
To come to the second question, and then you'll have to remind me what the first one was. The second question was really, who will have the authority and the responsibility to decide what happens in the aftermath? If we're bailing out the banks and bailing out the corporations, it's going to be them. And they're going to do it however they choose. And that will be a very difficult situation for a large part of the population who will remain unemployed, who will not be, the corporations are not interested in, they're interested in their own business models, their own welfare. They're interested in the incomes of their own executives. So we'll be looking at a situation in which power is devolved to entities which are detached from the broader public interest. Or we can do it the other way, define what the public interest is as broadly as possible, and build up a post-pandemic economy based upon that strength. That's what we did after the Second World War in this country. All right, it was a very different situation. And we had a household sector which is made financially sound solid by the war and held bonds. and a structure of regulation and organization that was, broadly speaking, developed a strong middle class that held out for 30 or 40 years. It eroded since then. Oligarchies behave. I don't think this is news to anybody I'm speaking with. Oligarchies behave in their own interest. And if they're not kept under very effective control, then that interest runs against the broad population in very, very serious ways. I don't think we can tolerate it. I don't think it will be, I mean, I don't know whether it will be tolerated, but I think if that is the direction we're going, and that is the direction we've been going in the early part of this response, it's going to unleash a lot of tension, social conflict, and demographic disaster as we go forward. And that's experience that you and the Russian Federation have been through. You know what it's like. This is not specific to socialism or capitalism. It's specific to the way in which powers and resources are concentrated and how they're used when they become excessively concentrated. So I think we have good models and we have bad models, and we have to choose between them. Now, come back to your first question, because I'm having
about Greece. About
Greece. Oh, Greece. And what about Greece?
Well, what about Greece? What happened? Because they showed us a very interesting phenomenon. They suffered a lot in the crisis before, but now, what's happened with them to now?
Well, Greece has been in a kind of purgatory since, well, really for 10 years, since 2010, from which it attempted to emerge in 2015, and that attempt was not successful. The government basically capitulated under very strong pressure. And since that time, it has been a protectorate, an unprotected protectorate, basically a country which has been liquidating what assets it has, and those have been on the auction block for a long time. The result is a shell of the country that was there and the country that could be there. And I have a lot of just only fellow feeling and comradeship for my Greek friends who are still trying to find a way out of this. And of course, these events are going to make it much more difficult, and they're making it, of course, enormously difficult for Italy, for Spain. And we'll see what happens, because it may be that means that the southern voices in the Mediterranean countries and the countries that have been in debt, and the countries that have been on the losing end of a very unbalanced situation in the European Union, will now have a solidarity and a force that they didn't have in 2015. Greece could not get the support of Spain or Portugal, or for that matter. Got a little sympathy from Italy, but no real support. And the situation right now is much broader, much more serious. And maybe the European Union will respond to that, but the action so far has not been impressive. And so we'll see what people decide they want to do.
Probably yes. I don't know. It's
Thank you.
phenomenal.
Thank you, Jamie. Gentlemen and ladies, would somebody else like to put questions or make comments, because we are nearing to the end of our first seminar, and Jamie, as far as I know, he has a meeting beginning in several minutes. Yes.
Well, you have a better grip on my calendar than I do. I completely lost track of the time.
Please, you are welcome. Just
I see Natalia's got her hand up. Natalia is.
Yes.
Please.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Do you hear me? Yeah. So first of all, let me thank you, James, for a very provocative presentation, and many thanks to our organizers for this conference. And let me return to some economic features, some specific features of this crisis, if you don't mind. In my view, it is very different. It is very different as compared to all previous shocks of the past decade. And it can't be fully described within the traditional economics. First of all, the recession was triggered by a non-economic factor. And then it is not about traditional violation of supply-demand proportions. It was rather about the simultaneous compression of both during the breakdowns in global supply chains, yes? So in my view, it seems to me that this crisis is the first full-scale implementation of radical uncertainty. And neither theoreticians nor practitioners have ever encountered before such kind of situation. You know that radical uncertainty is not just about the increase in market volatility or an acceleration of predictive changes. It is a situation of fully unpredictable changes, which the OECD report calls unknown unknowns. And in this situation, investors and governments cannot calculate economic risks as they did it before, and they cannot predict the future economic dynamics through the extrapolation of the current trends. So this situation is associated with the spread of digital technology. And we know that the development of economic systems has acquired very different features. Non-linearity, disequilibrium, unpredictability, all these things, and so on. And from this point of view, a good food for thought about the specifics of this crisis can be provided by not by complexity economics, for instance. Yes? And from this standpoint, the current crisis seems to be, well, in my view, it is the first typical crisis of the era of digital communications and of the era of globalization of production, yes? Because it reflects the increased interconnectedness of national economies through information and trade exchanges, yes? Through the joint creation of technologically sophisticated products with global value chains, yes? And this type of crisis, as we can see, is not just generated by market or by state failures. It is generated by systemic failures in the communicational environment, yes? When a break in social ties can automatically lead to a break in production and trade ties, yes? And such failures are typical for an informational society and for the emerging knowledge-based economy, yeah?
Natalia, could
yes,
you be a little bit shorter, yes?
Yes. That's why I just want to share my own conclusions concerning the very specific reasons and I suppose the consequence of this crisis as compared to the previous ones. Thank you very much, and thank you, James, for your good, very interesting presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I agree this is an exceptional crisis. I'm not sure I would say that it's entirely without historical precedent. I do think that if one goes back far enough, even in distant living memory, you can find useful parallels. And I drew immediately already 6 weeks ago when I started writing on this, on the mobilization for the Second World War. Admittedly, you could see that coming. There was certain preparation before that, but it was still, in the United States case, a surprise, requiring major changes quite quickly. It was in my family experience because my father was thrown into a leadership role in the mobilization, particularly dealing with civilian supply and prices. And other economists, Simon Kuznets, and notably, but many others were part and parcel. Vasily Leontiev, another figure from my youth, were part and parcel of that effort. And what they understood was that this particular response to a particular set of sudden circumstances that had to be dealt with. You had to transform a demand-driven, consumer-driven economy into what was essentially a shortage economy with allocation and with directed purpose and with excess purchasing power diverted into savings instruments and so forth. You had to follow a playbook which Keynes wrote in 1940, how to pay for the war. And that's a relevant history for economists. The problem of economists is that they don't think back that far, and their textbooks don't deal with it, and they don't have an appropriate training to really understand. They don't have the imagination, and they're blinded by ideology from taking steps that should be taken. So you end up having policymakers who say, well, let's just do what we did in 2008. It's not the right solution. And that point of view, it's really very, very different from our recent experience. I also agree that as I said many times, that this experience affects different systems differently. And the one that we'd set up, which turns out to have been unacceptably vulnerable, that could have been predicted if people were open-minded and looked at it, but that was not the view that people had. And they have to adjust their thinking, or they're going to end up experiencing a lot of failures going forward. And so, say for us who are economists who keep open minds about things, it's a huge challenge. So long as we can continue to contribute something, it's something to which we can in fact make a contribution, because there are a great many things that can go wrong that we can perhaps try to forestall. I don't know. I think that's probably brings it, Sasha, to pretty much to the closing point. I want to say, first of all, once again, that it's been a huge privilege. So that I'll say xie to my Chinese friends who were here. Спасибо большое to all of my friends and all of my Russian friends. Большое спасибо. So it's really been a very, very fine discussion, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to engage with you on this. And I look forward to being a participant in the future. As a member of the visiting faculty, it seems to me, now that we've discovered how easy it is, someone said, well, you'll never be invited to Moscow again. I hope I can get back at some point.
We also hope, yes.
I hope so. But this is better than nothing, and but it's certainly actually really pretty good. So all I can say is
thank you, Jamie. Thank you. It was great. Dear friends, I think that we all are quite happy with what happened today. Really, this is our first international experience, and I believe that it was successful. And of course, it's because Jamie made such a good contribution to this discussion, and all other participants also, it seemed to me, were extremely interested and expressed a lot of very interesting ideas. Well, I think it would be correct if we expressed our opinion to what happened today. You see, in the bottom, we have a reaction, and so we can show to Jamie whether we do appreciate or do not appreciate what he was saying and what the discussion was. I do it like this. Yes, you can do this or that, as in Rome.
And I have to say, on the American version, you can only have a favorable reaction. So that just shows that we do have a certain amount of discipline.
And you know, probably all of you have followed chat. It was quite interesting, and we'll analyze it, of course. And some questions were answered by Jamie, who I understood was following it. And what is important, you know, is that some people, Alexei Kireev, Jan Scholte, they made their applications for being main speakers at our seminars. So now we have Jacques Sapir for the next seminar as the main speaker. And then please just try to gauge your possibilities and and join the seminar. Keep with us and take active part in the discussion. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you.
Sash, there is a more simple way to express our feelings.